Hello, class. Welcome to Assessment of Student Learning, and I will be your course facilitator, and I will be your discussant as well for this session. This is yours truly. I am your Sir Rafa, and you can subscribe in my channel, YouTube channel, Sir Paeng, so you can visit there for more informations or more learnings about the basic concepts of assessment in learning. So basically, we will be discussing what are the concepts or the basic concepts in terms of assessment of student learning. So as we start, allow me first to distinguish the basic terms in terms of assessment. So many, or for instance, we tend to encounter testing, measurement, evaluation, and assessment in terms of assessment in learning. However, sometimes we tend to interchange these terminologies because we are thinking that test is somewhat the same to testing. Testing is somewhat the same to measurement, or sometimes we tend to interchange evaluation to assessment. However, these terminologies are different from each other. Now, to make it clear, we will be defining these terms. As we start, when we talk about test, it refers to a tool. So it is a device that is being used by a particular teacher to examine your knowledge of something or to determine what you have learned in a particular lesson. So for example, your teacher will give you a test. The purpose of that is to measure to what extent you have learned about a particular lesson. That's why don't be afraid if your teacher will give a test. However, if you are not ready, so that's the time that you will get anxiety in terms of getting the test. Second, we will have testing. So testing is the process. So it is the process of measuring the level of skill or the knowledge that we have learned in a particular lesson. So take note of the term. Test is a tool or a device. Testing is the process of administering or measuring the knowledge that you have learned. Next, we encountered as well in assessment in learning the term measurement. So what comes into your mind when you hear the term measurement? From the word measure. So basically, when we measure, what we are measuring is, for instance, we measure time. What time is it? We measure the height. You measure your weight, your temperature, for instance, if you're not feeling well. So you measure your length, so on and so forth. So basically, when we measure, what we are looking here is the quantity. That's why it says here, it is the process of quantifying a particular data or characteristics. Meaning to say, when we measure, it involves numbers. So for instance, your teacher made to check your paper and then it yields result or a score. Your score is part of measurement. It's because it involves number or data. So that's it for measurement. However, when we talk about evaluation, of course, when you evaluate, you are making judgment. You render judgment based on criteria and evidences. Take note, we are not simply making our evaluation without criteria or specific standard. That's why every time we are being invited, for instance, on an event to be a judge, so basically there is a criteria or a rubric or a scoring guide. So that's the role of being an evaluator. And take note, it's not easy to evaluate your students' progress. And lastly, we have the term assessment. So basically, when we talk about assessment, it refers to the process of the process of number one, we describe, collect, record, score, and interpret results or data obtained from students' learning. So as you can notice, assessment refers to the process of both qualifying and quantifying data. Because if we are going to look the interrelationship of these terms, we can see here that test is the smallest, followed by testing, Next, we have measurement, evaluation, and then the biggest one or the broadest one is what we call the assessment. So meaning to say, testing, measurement, evaluation, that's under umbrella of the term assessment. That's why we have the term assessment in student learning, because when we do assessment, we tend to evaluate, we measure, we provide tests, and then we are making tests as well. So I hope we are clear with the basic terminologies in terms of assessment. Now, let's start with the first part of our discussion, which is all about, of course, the test. Now, we will be discussing testing, measurement, evaluation, and assessment. Meaning to say, for this course, there are 5 major topics that we need to discuss. So as we start, let's recapitulate or reiterate the definition of a test. And it says here, it refers to an instrument, a tool, or a device that is used or designed to measure any quantity, ability, skill, or knowledge of a particular student. So don't get confused. When we talk about test, it refers to a tool or a device. Now, let me ask you, so what do you think is the purpose of giving the test? So why do you think teachers are giving tests? So why is it every time you enter a class, for instance, because there are a lot of teachers are fond of giving tests before they start their class, what do you think is the reason why? Do you think it's a form of punishment or discipline since you are not listening? Or since you are too noisy inside the class, that's why your teacher will give a test? Or maybe since you are not prepared to discuss new lessons. So I am not saying in general, however, these are isolated cases. There are some teachers who are not prepared to discuss new lesson. They will opt to give a test, of course, to kill time as well. Is it because you have something to do which is urgent or important? For instance, you have a meeting with a principal, you have a meeting with your immediate supervisor, so on and so forth. That's why you will leave students or learners with a test, even though it's not meant to give the test, or maybe for compliance purposes. So which one is the reason why you are giving the test if you are a teacher? So again, as a punishment, you're not prepared, you have something to do which is urgent and important, or for compliance purposes. For instance, you need to have 10 quizzes before the prelim, for instance. So you have 8. So you're telling yourself, I need to give 2 additional quizzes for me to meet the number of tests. So for compliance. So I hope these are not the reasons why we are giving the test. Now, let's reveal what are the main reasons why we are conducting or why we are giving tests. So we will be discussing what are the purposes of giving tests. So number 1, the main reason why we are giving tests is to assess or to evaluate students' learning, or to assess what students have learned. So that's the most important reason why we are giving tests. Second, of course, we are giving tests to determine or to identify their strength and weaknesses. That's why we have diagnostic tests, we have placement tests, we have different types of tests later on we will be discussing. And then lastly, to measure effectiveness of teaching. Take note, in every end of the lesson, we need to determine our instructional decision, or what we call our ID. So our instructional decision will determine whether we are going to reteach, we are going to enhance, or we are going to proceed with our lesson. So for instance, if we are going to reteach or to enhance, that means there is something wrong with your teaching. It means there is something wrong with your lesson plan, or there is something wrong with the teaching learning process. That's why sometimes tests are being used to measure teaching effectiveness. Next, what are the different classifications of your test? So can you please give me what are examples of tests? So what are the different classifications of tests? So basically, there are different types of tests. Number one, we have standardized test, and second one is your teacher-made test. Now, what's the difference between standardized and teacher-made test? Now, when we talk about standardized from the word standard, so these are types of tests wherein carefully constructed by the experts in the light of accepted objectives. So what are examples of standardized tests? So we have your national achievement test, we have your licensure examination for board exam, right? So we have also your national NCEA, right? So these are examples of your standardized tests. It's because these are made by the experts, meaning to say these are not only made by your classroom teachers, however, these are made by or recommended by the experts. That's why it is being called standardized test, meaning to say this is not only being used for classroom testing, however, these are being used by many or common. For example, standardized test for English. So these are being used by all English teachers. However, when we talk about teacher-made test, so basically it is done by a classroom teacher. So constructed by a classroom teacher, which measure and appraise students' progress in terms of the learning objective. So the purpose of a teacher-made test is to measure whether your learning objective per lesson is being met. So later on, we will be discussing what are examples of standardized tests and then teacher-made tests. Now, so these are two major classifications of your test. Again, what's the first? We have here standardized test, and then the second one, we have your teacher-made test. Standardized being made by the experts, and then teacher-made test being constructed by a classroom teacher. All right, so let's discuss what are examples of your standardized test. So number one, we have here your ability test. So ability test, I know that this is not unusual for you. So we are familiar with the ability test, basically to measure our verbal, numeric, reasoning, and computation skills. So these are, or this is an example of your ability test. So we have your combination of verbal, numeric, reasoning, and computation. So this is evident in terms of getting the National Career Assessment Examination or the NCEA. Second, we have your aptitude test. So we have here aptitude. From the word aptitude, it measures potential. Take note of the term. When you measure potential, what you are getting is aptitude test. So what's the purpose of aptitude test? Again, to measure your potential. Next, another example of, so that's it. So we have, let's go back to examples of standardized test. So we have here aptitude, and then we have your ability test. Now let's proceed to examples of your teacher-made test. So we have here, or what are the tests being made by the teacher? So these are the teacher-made tests. So number one, we have here objective type of test, and then the second one is what we call the subjective type of test. Take note, we have the objective type of test, and then we have the subjective type of test. Now, what are the objective type of test or objective test? So basically, when we talk about objective test, it answers, or these type of tests have single, take note of the term, these are tests with single word, phrase, or symbol answer. Meaning to say, these are tests which need specific answer. So what are examples of tests with specific answer? So number one, we have multiple choice. It's impossible that in a particular item, for instance, in item number 1, multiple choice, there are 2 answers. So it's not valid item. So it could be only A, B, C, or D. That's why you have options to choose which one is the best answer. So example of multiple choice, here we go. We have here STEM, the terms, take note of the key terms. We have the STEM here, and then we have the destructors. Now, very important, we are familiar with the multiple choice type of test. However, we are not able to teach how to determine each part. So we have here example of multiple choice type of test. So we have here, after doing the exercise on verbs, Ms. Barillo gave a short quiz to find out how well students have understood the lesson. So what type of assessment was done? So basically the question is what we call the STEM. So this is our STEM, and then the options or destructors are the choices. So we have here 4 options or destructors. So we have A, B, C, or D. So let's recap. So the question is the STEM, and then the destructors are the choices or the options. And take note, when we talk about options or destructors, there are what we call correct answers. Now, for instance, we have here for item number 1, after doing the exercise on verb, Ms. Barillo gave a short quiz to find out how well students have understood the lesson. So she gave a quiz after the lesson. So this is an example of summative, formative, diagnostic, or placement. So we have the correct answer here, which is formative. And take note, the correct answer for a multiple choice type of test is other known as the keyed option. Now, another example of teacher-made test is what we call your true-false type of test. I think this is your favorite type of test because there is a 50% guarantee that you will get the correct answer, unlike with the multiple choice. For multiple choice, only 25% probability that you will get the correct answer. It's because there are 4 options. However, for true or false, 50-50. It's either true or false. So we have here true or false. So a combination of 2 options. That's why it is sometimes called alternative test, because you have 2 options, either right or wrong, true or false, correct or incorrect, yes or no, fact or opinion, so on and so forth. It is a test that made of dichotomous, meaning to say there are 2 options that you need to choose. So it's impossible to have the correct answer, which is trolls. Okay, so only one answer. So that's why it is teacher-made or objective test. It's because there is a specific or single best answer. So here we go. So this is an example of what we call the teacher-made test, which is true or false. So let's answer. Item number 1. A test is a tool or a device that is used to measure what students have learned in the lesson. So what's the answer? So true or false? So we have here, the correct answer is true. So as what I have said, it's impossible to have 2 answers because this is objective type of test. So the correct answer here is true. Second, measurement is the process of giving judgment. So take note, when we measure, the key term is quantify, meaning to say we are not making judgment, but we are quantifying data. So this is false, because when we make judgment, what we are doing is not measurement. What we are doing is evaluation. So I hope we are clear with the true or false type of test. Next, another example of teacher-made type of test is what we call the matching type. So the matching type, of course, there are 2 columns. We have column A and then the column B. And take note, column A is what we call the premises, and column B is what we call the responses. May hugot si Sir. Buti pa sa matching type, may kamatch. Ikaw, may kamatch ka ba? So there is a what you call matching process in terms of matching type of test. Next, another type of teacher-made test, which is objective type of test, is what we call your may sumagot po. So we have here your completion test or fill in the blank. So take note in terms of fill in the blank. So it is composed of incomplete statement. It could be yung missing is a word, a phrase, or it could be number. It depends on what we are looking for a particular answer. So we have here an example of fill in the blank. So in our later discussion, we will be discussing the do's and don'ts in terms of making this test. Okay, but for the meantime, we will be classifying the different types of tests. Next, another type of test is what we call your essay test. Take note, I've mentioned objective and then subjective type of test. So take note, when we talk about objective, there is single or specific answer. However, when we talk about subjective type of test, from the word itself, subject, bakit tinawag siyang subjective type of test? It's because these types of tests are being based on your personal knowledge about a particular question or item. So one example of your subjective type of test is what we call your essay. So take note, questions provide freedom of response that is needed to adequately assess students' ability to formulate. So you will organize and you will evaluate ideas. And there are two types of your essay test. We have the restricted and then we have your extended essay. So what is restricted essay? So restricted, from the word restrict, there are limitations. There are parameters. For instance, the teacher will say, in not more than 5 sentences, you are going to define beauty. That's an example of what we call restricted essay. However, when we talk about extended essay, students have freedom to elaborate their answer. Students have freedom to discuss their answers as long as you will follow a specific criteria or rubric in terms of assessing or evaluating your responses or answers. So these are the two types of your essay, restricted and then extended essay. Another type of test or other type of test is what we call your psychological test. Perhaps we are all familiar with psychological test. I assume that we are all familiar with psychological type of test. So it aims to measure our intangible aspect of behavior like intelligence, yung hindi natin makikita through inside the classroom through a teacher-made type of test. So there are experts that measures our intelligence, our attitude, our interest, and aptitudes. That's why we have guidance and counselors, so on and so forth, to administer these types of tests. Also, we have here, very important to determine other types of tests. We have the mastery test and then the power test. So when we talk about mastery test, what we are measuring here is mastery of the lesson. To what extent you master a particular lesson. So quote unquote, sometimes you are telling your teacher na, ay si ma'am parang pabalik-balik, so on and so forth with the lesson. So the purpose of repeating or putting extent to the degree of the lesson is for you to master a particular topic. And then we have here the power test. So what's the purpose of power test? Of course, from the word power, of course, it measure your level of performance under sufficient time, condition, and consist of items arranged from easy to difficult. So there is an increasing difficulty. So take note of the key terms. When we talk about mastery, we measure the level of Of course, mastery of the lesson. Power test, we measure the level of performance based on the increasing difficulty level. For example, easy, the average, difficult. So that's an example of power test. Quiz B is one example of measuring your power test. So for instance, you cannot proceed to the difficult level unless you were able to surpass the easy and average level. Next, another is what we call the speed test. Okay, hope we are clear with the different types of tests. Now, in next meeting or in our next video, we will be discussing what are the characteristics of a good test, and we will be discussing as well what are the do's and don'ts, what are the thumbs up rule in terms of making these types of tests. So I hope we are clear with what we discussed for today, and I hope we are learning with fun with our discussion for this session. Right? So stay safe, everyone, and see you in our next presentation. Goodbye and God bless everyone.